Hey now everybody, this is Professor Island, and today we're discussing critical analysis, and today's specific discussion is on argument weaknesses and fallacies. Fallacy basically is a weak argument. It is usually a weak argument because it's based on some ill-conceived notion or some insufficient information. Within that context, when we talk about the word argument, we don't mean a disagreement. What we mean is somebody putting forth an idea as to what something, in this case, what a piece of literature means. If you are to write a paragraph that is a biographical translation of something by Emily Dickinson, your argument is that the work is a reflection of her life, and your evidence is that the biographical information balanced against what the poem says is going to reveal that the poem is indeed about her. When arguments fall apart is usually because there are one of several things happening. The first essentially is that the work does not have enough material in it to support that analysis. In other words, you're going to say, well, this poem by Emily Dickinson is about her, and then you look through the poem and you realize she makes very few phrases or claims that actually apply to her life as you understand it by looking at a biography. Other fallacious arguments stem from a preconceived notion about the author or about the work that is actually not true. For example, some of the arguments that are made about, for example, Edgar Allan Poe's work, about Emily Dickinson's work, about Ernest Hemingway's work, are often based on a perception by certain critics that that person likes or dislikes something. That Hemingway hates women, that Edgar Allan Poe is simply a drunkard, and that he hates rich people, that Emily Dickinson was in love with this particular woman. These things have to be proven as part of the argument. And if your secondary sources cannot prove that information, then the argument is weak. It doesn't mean that they're not true in a real sense. However, part of your approach to this analysis is that you're using secondary source material and primary source material to make the best argument, the most supportable argument possible. The same way that a lawyer would in a courtroom, or that you would in a speech in your speech class. The idea is that you're trying to be you're trying to be as clear and as persuasive as possible. And to do that, you're looking for the best argument possible. To that end, I may ask you to find an argument that is indeed fallacious, to find a translation of a work that actually does not work. And the purpose of that is to get you to see that there are plenty of criticisms about some of the things that you read, some of the things that you see, that are actually not really based in sound argument as much as they're just simply put out there, and people automatically say, oh, well, that sounds good to me because it fits the way I see the world. This especially affects people when it comes to things like politics and religion and other things, when it comes to how people feel about issues, and they automatically assume that, oh, well, if somebody said that, it must be true, when in reality, if you dig into it, you realize that there's not a lot of validity there. When you're trying to find fallacious arguments in politics or in a history analysis, you go to some books and find out whether or not the statistics hold up. And that's a different class. And if you get into an argumentation class or some other kind of statistical analysis, maybe the Argumentation English 104 on this fine campus, where you're actually looking at speeches and claims and political speech and such, you would do that. However, when it comes to a piece of art, who's right, who's wrong? The fallacious argument actually would come from the person who is making the critical analysis, and they may make claims either about the work itself or about the author or about the author's motivation that are provably inaccurate or that are unprovable in and of themselves. So to that end, if you're looking for a fallacy, you're primarily looking for a fallacy in a critic, in a critique, in the critic's perspective of the work. You're not looking for example, reading a story and you say, well, yeah, you know, Hemingway is a bad writer because, look, he made this character really weak and this character is despicable. Well, the author did that on purpose. The character is supposed to be despicable. You're supposed to hate them. That's not weak writing. That's actually good writing because it makes you respond to it. It's what you're looking for is some kind of analysis by a critic in which they look at it and they say, well, this is what's going on. And then when you do some research, you realize, well, actually, that's not true at all. The author meant this. Well, here's a review or here's an article where the author says that's not what the author meant at all. The story says this. Well, actually, no, that's a misreading. The story actually says that. And this is where you'll get these fallacious arguments from. There are also some arguments that are just generally made against authors that have to do with logic and speech. And in fact, you take a logic class, an argumentation class, a speech class, you may come across some of these arguments. And these things actually occur when it comes to literary analysis. One of them is called ad hominem. It literally means to the man. This is used both positive ways and negative ways, oddly enough. And the negative way it's used is something along the lines of this. A particular author develops a reputation for writing a particular kind of literature, and very often is not considered literature. Somebody like Stephen King, Judith Krantz, somebody like that. Somebody who's very popular but writes very accessible material. And after a while, the critics do not even consider them literary writers. They consider them to be pulp fiction writers. That essentially this is something that's designed for the immature reader. It's full of blood and gore and excitement and sex and all this other great stuff. And obviously it cannot be literary. Basically what they're saying is because this person is who they are, they cannot write great literature, which of course is a fallacy. Their critics are technically required, or should be required, to look at every individual work and to evaluate it on its own merit. And even though King himself in this case says, he's never going to win a Pulitzer Prize, primarily because he knows how he's viewed, this kind of comes back around the other way as well. There are certain authors who very early on or over a period of time have developed a fantastic reputation, a great deal of respect in the literary world, and literally they can write anything and somebody is going to say it's great simply because of the person who wrote it. And again, that is a fallacy. About 10, 15 years ago, Joyce Carol Oates, the great American writer, whose material you might have seen in a work like Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, etc., she puts out a book, and the LA Times article says, oh, here's the book review section, Joyce Carol Oates put out a new book. They did not discuss a single element of that book. Instead, what they did is they spent the entire article discussing what a great writer, historically, Joyce Carol Oates is. That's a lame argument. It's a weak argument, because essentially what they're saying is, go out and get this book because she's a great writer, not go out and get this book because it's a great book. That's an ad hominem argument. They're essentially laying everything on to the author themselves and not really paying attention to what the work is. In the same way, with writers get a certain reputation for the kind of material they do. If you look at something like Hemingway and his notorious behavior as an individual, as a real person, and of course his writing is often associated with a certain misogynistic view. That means everything that is put out by Hemingway very often is just categorized in this broad brush, especially by feminist writers, as being anti-woman. And there are many examples within his works in which he writes strong female characters, or more importantly, he writes all of his characters as weak and as despicable, and it's not that he hates women as much as he hates everybody. It's important that the critic is evaluating the work for what the work actually is, instead of relying on the reputation of the author. Not everything that Shakespeare did is great work. Not everything that Henry Miller did is great work. Not everything that Stephen King did is for the immature reader. And it's important that we look at these works separately and individually. The other option, kind of in the same ballpark, is ad populum. Ad populum literally means to the people. And what it is that's an argument that basically says because a bunch of people said it, it must be true. Hey, UFOs exist. Why? Because a bunch of people believe it. Where's the evidence? Well, because everybody believes it. That's not evidence. That doesn't mean that they do or do not exist. It just simply means if you're trying to make the point, we need something stronger than just the fact that a lot of people believe it. This goes back to literary analysis. Everybody knows that Shakespeare's a great writer. Everybody knows that Beavis and Butthead has no redeeming value. Why? Because a bunch of people have already said it. Ad populum arguments will often rely on the notoriety of the work, generally, the notoriety of the artist. In some ways, an ad populum, but what they'll do is they'll, instead of relying on saying all the things about the author, they'll rely on what other critics have said and how people respond to it. Again, in an odd way, this also comes back on the other way. When something is very popular by the masses or with the masses, it very often is not considered having literary merit. Something that is too popular, therefore, must be accessible to a large number of people, and not that many people actually can read real literature according to the literary hierarchy. And to that end, something that is vastly popular very often will be scandalized. The J.K. Rowling series for Harry Potter, incredibly popular, one of the most popular written series in English history. It was categorized as basically being juvenile, that it had no literary merit, etc., etc. And the idea was because it was so popular among kids that it was not of some kind of value. Other critics have turned around and said, you're kind of missing the point. It's not that somebody's going to read Harry Potter and dumb themselves down because they'd already been reading Proust or something. It's actually that this person has never picked up a book before. They're going to read Harry Potter, they're going to get through the entire series, and then they're going to be hungry for more, and they're going to move on to the next thing. In other words, trying to find some kind of literary value here. The ad populum argument that basically says that something is for children, that something is for the masses, that something is a throwaway work, that something is pulp fiction, whatever. This kind of mentality essentially is relying on what's already been done, and the critic is basically being lazy by saying, hey, everybody's already criticized it, and here's what it is. And you definitely, if you see that, you want to pull that out and say that's an ad populum argument. There is also the ad verecundium argument, which basically means to wisdom. And it's the idea basically that if a wise old guy said it, it must be true. A lot of wise old guys have said a lot of things that are not true, and certainly if we look at old portrayals, or classical portrayals of literature, things have certainly changed in the terms of roles of women, roles of minorities, roles of class, and all these other kinds of things. It's the notion that somebody relies on an adage to make their point. They throw out a quote by Milton, a quote by Jefferson, whatever, as if that's going to make their point for them, when in reality that person lived at a different time in a different era, and things were different, and we live in a different era now. It's again, this is kind of like somebody phoning in an analysis by saying, well, you know, this guy once said this, and that's what's going on in the story. You're not going to find that as much as the ad populum and the ad hominem argument. You have a couple arguments in which somebody will essentially try to analyze something by comparing it to something else. And very often what they'll do is they'll compare it unfavorably. And one of those is the faulty comparison. And the two faulty comparisons are incomplete and false analogy. The incomplete comparison basically compares the strong aspects of a work they like versus the weak aspects of a work they don't like. And they're very selective. They don't take into account the entire thing. If a critic is analyzing a work and comparing it to yet another work, especially if they say, you know, this writer used to be great, and now they put this thing out, and this is not so good, they have to make the complete comparison. They can't just pick and choose the things that make their argument. In the same way, you have the false analogy, where somebody will compare one aspect of one story to a completely different aspect of another story, and it's basically comparing apples and oranges, where a critic is really relying on you to say, well, if this one part is bad, then the whole thing must be bad, compared to how great this one is because this part over here is great. If they're going to discuss character development, it has to be character development in both stories. If they're going to discuss things like the portrayal of women, and portrayal of women in both stories. And there has to be consistency between the two arguments. But there's also some generalizations that fit the ad populum and ad hominem arguments. The hasty generalization, oh, it's science fiction. It's crap. Oh, look, I can barely understand what's going on. It must be great. It was written by Shakespeare. It must be brilliant. It was written by Judith Krantz. It must be some kind of love story. This kind of hasty generalization, oh, it's in this category, this category, this category, is, again, a lazy approach to analysis, and really what we're looking for is for the critic to look at the work in and of itself and to see whether or not it has merit in and of itself. And then finally, there's some rhetorical fallacies, and this has to do with the wording that the critic uses to analyze a work. Things like semantic ambiguity. Things like, the work is good, or the work is meaningful. When you're doing a literary analysis, especially from a cultural perspective, meaningful to whom? In what way? And in fact, I want you to avoid these kinds of semantic problems in your own work. Don't tell me that a work is good. I don't want your opinion about it anyway. If you think a particular audience would like it, you would say this particular audience would agree with these aspects of the story. And what you're doing, it's forcing you to write specific claims and to make specific connections between the audience and the work in order to say, from a cultural perspective, this group would like it. From a reader response, this individual would dislike it, whatever it happens to be. Don't be vague. Other things have to do with slanting, and this is also something I want you to avoid in your work. If you like something, you cannot constantly use language that tells me that you like it. You cannot constantly tell me how awesome Tupac is and how he's brilliant and how his life-changing work is a manifest for the downtrodden. If that's a translation from a Marxist perspective, you need to tell me that. If that's a cultural translation from a particular group, that's valid. If you're doing that to explain just generally what it is in a supposedly objective way, you're not being objective at all. The same thing if you're writing about something you dislike. You can't use terminology that makes it clear that you as the writer have feelings for it, positive or negative. Don't put any slant in there. Instead, when you're doing your critical analysis from a particular cultural or reader response or feminist perspective, you have to lay those impressions and those ideas and those translations onto that particular mentality. Young people would find that this is really interesting and really relates to their life because, and they would find that this is groundbreaking because, and they would find that this is lame because, and that forces you to stick to the analysis rather than putting yourself into it. Ultimately, what I'm looking for is your use of a logical process in which you're finding literary analysis that's valid and useful. And as part of that, you're going to come across analyses that are just not really that helpful. And part of it will be because they're poor arguments. It doesn't mean they didn't get published. It means either times have changed or something got through here and there, and you will find translations that you do not agree with. As part of that, look for the weakness in it. Look for the argument that does not hold together, and that should help you to find these rhetorical fallacies. I usually only apply this to my higher level classes, but this is something you should be aware of as you're reading anyway. And when somebody is discussing your favorite book or your favorite movie and you're listening to them talk, ask yourselves why they like or dislike the work. If they say things like, well, you know, I hate romances, so I didn't like this movie. Well, that person already has a bias against the entire genre of material. They're not going to like your romance movie because they don't like romance movies at all. There's anything wrong with that particular movie. They're not talking about plot or cinematography or the use of character or the dialogue. They're just saying romance movies suck. That means your romance movie sucks too. That's a real hasty generalization that does not really analyze the work fairly, and that's the kind of thing you're looking for when you're analyzing literature, you're analyzing art, and you're using secondary sources as your support. Make sure the ones that you're finding do not have these weaknesses, and if you're looking for a weakness, look for the ones that do. Okay? Hope that helps. Stay in touch.